Okay, hello everybody. We are starting a few minutes early, and there's a very good reason for that, and that's because Caleb, my guest tonight, has to leave early. So welcome to another of my takes on China. Today, I'm going to be asking Caleb T. Maupin, a US communist or socialist, or both, and author of books and articles about the topic, to discuss a relatively new phenomenon, the MAGA communists. So Caleb, welcome to my little show, and thank you for volunteering to help me learn something about this. I hope that I'm going to understand a little bit more. But before we get started, I have one question, unrelated to MAGA communism and more related to everyday life in America. So I've read that being a communist in the United States is tolerated but technically illegal. You have the right of free speech, but you also have an archaic law which says that being a member of the Communist Party of the United States is actually illegal. How does that work for you? Are you able to express yourself as freely as you like, or do you need to self-censor to avoid stepping over some imaginary line?
Well, the law you're referring to is called the Smith Act, and it's not enforced at this point. The Supreme Court ruled in 1957 with Yates versus the United States that you have the right to be a member of the Communist Party or advocate communism as long as you don't try to carry out the violent overthrow of the government. So the Supreme Court basically nullified that part in 1957, which was actually a response to the Khrushchev secret speech. After Khrushchev gave his secret speech condemning Stalin as kind of a diplomatic favor to the Soviet Union, they did that. But then there's a more recent court ruling. You've probably heard of Brandenburg versus Ohio, which is a ruling that there was a Ku Klux Klan guy who bought some time on American television. And he called for acts of revengeance against elected officials for the Civil Rights Act. And he was arrested for that. And he said, well, that's my freedom of speech. And the Supreme Court agreed with him. So the limits on freedom of speech in the United States are very wide. Now, there's some anti-terrorism laws that have kind of rolled that back to some degree. They have arrested people for advocating terrorism. So it's complicated. But as of now, your ability to openly call yourself a communist is pretty legal in the United States. The Communist Party, they do, I think if you're becoming a U.S. citizen, one of the questions is, are you a member of the Communist Party? And if you say yes, they can deny your citizenship on that basis. And I believe in California, in order to be a teacher or a government employee, you must sign a document, making clear you're not a member of the Communist Party. So it depends, but those laws that do exist in a lot of different states, they generally have been nullified by the Supreme Court. That's my understanding.
Yeah, my understanding was it was only in Arizona, so you've got a more up-to-date or a more knowledgeable breadth of knowledge than I've got. So before we get on to the topic of MAGA communism, well, we're going to get onto that topic straight away. You've agreed to come on here because you've written a book about this, and there's a Where is America going by Caleb T. Maupin?
Where is America going? Marxism, MAGA, and the coming revolution. So
right, okay, so great, good plug.
Yeah.
So in your book, have you covered this aspect? Because I'm on Twitter quite a lot, X on Twitter, and what I've noticed is there seems to be some kind of a rift between what are traditionally leftists, the socialists, communists, Marxists, Leninists, those ists, and MAGA communists, because we're going to come back to this later, but is there a rift? Because to me, it seems like MAGA communists must be right-wing and socialists must be left-wing, and there seems to be some kind of rift going on. Is that true?
Well, yes. I would put it, the way I would put it is that, that what the left, in quotes, because what does left and right really mean at the end of the day? It gets very confusing. What the left has traditionally stood for is not what the woke movement or the left in the United States stands for anymore. And if you believe in those things, you're generally categorized or accused of being on the right. So that makes things very, very confusing. But my beliefs haven't changed, right? I got interested in communism when I was a young man. I was involved in communist groups in high school. I worked for Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General, an international lawyer. I was part of Occupy Wall Street. I was involved in police brutality protests. And, I'm a reporter for international television. I've done solidarity work with anti-imperialist countries around the world. What I believe in is eradicating poverty. What I believe in is a centrally planned economy where the banks, factories, and industries and the centers of economic power are organized to serve public good and not the profits of a wealthy few. And the goal is to eventually build a world with so much abundance and so much wealth that the need for all coercion and a state eventually breaks down, right? With a rationally planned economy, that's socialism, we can eventually move toward that ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world of vast abundance called communism. And that's the Marxist understanding. And that, imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage is holding back development around the world, keeping countries in poverty, and that it's the rule of profits and it must be opposed, right? And we should have a socialist planned economy. That's what I believe in. But according to the bulk of the so-called left, if you believe that, you're a quote unquote fascist. Because now much of the left promotes what they call degrowth. They think growth is the problem. They think, that human beings are a cancer on the planet, that we all need to be poorer. And they also oppose any notion of central planning. They view that as authoritarian or whatever. And they argue socialism is just a worker cooperative scheme or something like that. And so the left has kind of gone in a different direction. As far as MAGA communism, that's not really my brand, so to speak. I think it's not strategic because anyone who's MAGA, anyone who's a big Trump supporter, they're going to be very opposed to communism. And anyone who's a communist is going to be very, very opposed to MAGA. So it's not good branding, but I like the idea of it, which is that engaging with people in Trump's base, in Trump's camp, about communism and understanding that they represent kind of working class people who are angry at the state, angry at the FBI, opposed to the wars, that the MAGA movement is kind of the beginning of the awakening of the American people that will lead to a genuine communist movement. That I like. And so that's why I embrace the movement to some degree or other. I embrace the concept, and I wrote the book. And that it's going to be the kind of people that are voting for Donald Trump, not all of whom are white. I mean, Trump gets more support among African Americans and other folks than any Republican president previously. It's going to be the people that are angry and opposed to the American establishment right now who are rallying around Trump. Eventually, I believe it'll be that kind of awakening that gives birth to a genuine socialist movement, and that what the left, the so-called left, has been reduced to is defending the political establishment. Most people in the United States who are left, what they go around doing is calling people racist, calling people sexist, calling people fascists, and repeating the message of CNN and MSNBC and trying to, help the United States destabilize countries around the world in the name of spreading human rights. And that's not what communism is about. And as somebody who attends international communist gatherings, I've been to 3 World Youth Festivals of the global communist movement. I've spent time in Venezuela. I've spent time in revolutionary countries around the world. I was just in Russia, where I got to meet with the Russian communist youth from the Communist Party, the supporters of Gennady Zhuganov and such. And I mean, the global communist movement that advocates development, that advocates, opposing imperialism, and people in the West who call themselves left, there's a huge gap between the two of them. And that what I stand for is much closer to what people in the MAGA movement want, which is, a government that serves working people. So that's why I think it's a very important development. I like the idea of MAGA communism to some degree or other, even though it's not the most strategic brand. That's the way I see it.
Do you think there's not such a great contradiction? You've got Donald Trump, who is a pure capitalist, I'm sure, who brags about how rich he is, what he owns. He's as pure a capitalist as they come. Yet he seems to be the figurehead of this new movement, which is as socialist as they come. Now, I see where it's going. I mean, people who are poor effectively. The very bottom end of the working class will be looking for a Medicare for all. They'll be looking for free education, or at least affordable education. They'll be looking for a planned economy where they're not going to get ripped off by financiers. They're not living their lives paying for rich people to get richer while they're getting poorer. I do get that. But is Donald Trump the right figurehead for them?
Well, I think that, again, Donald Trump represents a division in our American ruling class,
I
because
agree with that. Yeah.
at this point, there are big divisions among the American capitalists. Their system is in a crisis because of overproduction, right? And that's a really important point in Marxism, right? That no system ever has had a problem where people are hungry because there are too many houses, where people are homeless because there's too much food, right? And that self-driving cars should be a great thing. It should be tremendous to have self-driving cars. But in our irrational system, self-driving cars would lead to riots in the streets in the United States, because millions of people whose job is to drive a truck or drive a car or run a traffic court or whatever would lose their jobs. And self-driving cars is hanging over our economy as a curse. We have, because of the computer revolution, we have this crisis where they've gotten so good at producing products, and production is more efficient than ever before. And that's going to lead to greater poverty. That's not rational, right? And that's the problem with capitalism. And the computer revolution has led to an economic situation where the capitalist system is crashing and burning because there's no place for the workers at the assembly line. This is the problem of capitalism: poverty amid plenty. And the computer revolution has taken it to another level. So the capitalist class in the United States are fighting among themselves. Donald Trump represents a lower layer of the ruling class. You looked at his cabinet, he had a lot of billionaires in it. Betsy DeVos, she's a Trump supporter. She was his Secretary of Education. You had the My Pillow guy, the manufacturer guy, what's his name? Mike Lindell, My Pillow, right? And these are capitalists that aren't part of the club. They're not part of the elite group. And the Biden administration and the Democratic Party, they represent the upper layers of capital, the Silicon Valley tech monopolies, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, and the Carnegies. And there's a fight in the ruling class because it seems that the way the ultra rich and the tech monopolies and the entrenched oil banking dynasties that really run the country — people talk about the Eastern establishment or the Anglo-American establishment — they've resolved to solve the crisis with degrowth. In order to stabilize capitalism, they want to reduce consumption. They want to have the state, forcibly reduce consumption. And when you talk about the World Economic Forum and all these talk of, people, you'll own nothing and be happy about it, living in a pod, eating bugs, the sinister schemes they're dreaming up. This is to save their system from a crisis spawned by overproduction. And they want to force degrowth. Whereas Trump represents a layer of the capitalist class that just want to make money. They're not interested in this degrowth scheme. And that puts them, whether they want to recognize it or not, in the same camp as China, because that's what China wants. China wants development. It wants growth. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party, with the 5-year plans, they want to raise living standards. And the countries around the world that are fighting imperialism, they want development and growth as well. And it's the imperialists, the Western capitalist system, that is trying to stabilize itself by forcibly impoverishing the world. And that is the divide. And Donald Trump represents the lower levels of capital in the United States that want growth. And they're up against the imperialists, the ultra monopolists that want to impose degrowth. So at the end of the day, there's a common interest between the working class that wants a better life for working families, jobs, healthcare, schools, and education, and the countries around the world that are resisting imperialism, and those lower levels of capital. And the main enemy is imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, as Lenin wrote about, the ultra monopolies, and they're trying to save their system with forcible degrowth. So this is why I feel like there is potential. Donald Trump could be the beginning of an anti-monopoly coalition, as much as he himself might be opposed to such a thing. That's kind of my understanding.
Okay, let me bring this question in, because this leads me to my next question. MAGA is a big percentage of that is your population. Any movement that wants to succeed better include them. And my next question was, can this happen peacefully? I mean, go back 4 years, nearly 4 years. January the 6th movement, what went wrong that day? That was a nightmare for the political system, the democratic system. You didn't have a peaceful transition of power, and everything rests on that. So can this potential movement do it peacefully, or is it something that will need some kind of revolution?
Well, first of all, I want to say about January 6th, that was a setup. That was completely a setup by the American government. The doors of the Capitol were open. I've protested in Washington, D.C. my entire life. I've been protesting. You can't just walk into the Capitol. That was set up. And that videos have come out and showed that there were police officers taking MAGA people into the Capitol almost as tourists, and the FBI was heavily involved in making that happen. That's been almost admitted on the part of the government. It was a rowdy protest. There was a protest that happened, and a number of people went into the Capitol, and the prison sentences that have come out of that are insane. You get like elderly grandmas who went to the Donald Trump protest. They saw the doors to the Capitol were open, and they walked around in the Capitol with a sign, and they're locked up for 20 years. I mean, it's insane. And it was not an attempted coup because the military wasn't involved. It was some rowdy protesters that were allowed to get into a place that they shouldn't have gotten allowed into. And as somebody who has protested and will continue to protest against, police brutality in the United States, where the police, they shoot somebody, oh, we thought he had a gun, and they shoot him 20 times or whatever. I'm very opposed, and I have protested consistently against the crimes of the police. But what was done to Ashley Babbitt, she was in the Capitol. She didn't have a firearm. And, they didn't have to shoot her and kill her. The window broke. She went through the window. She didn't have a gun. She didn't have a weapon, and they shot her dead. And I have to oppose that. So in that sense, I'm opposed to the narrative around January 6th that it was some kind of attempted coup. I'm opposed to the narrative. But when you ask me about a peaceful transition to socialism and such, communists always have advocated a peaceful transition to socialism. The question is, will it be allowed? Right. I mean, and that's the question, right? I believe that eventually, as working people in the United States mobilize, demanding healthcare and jobs and schools and opposing the wars, they will mobilize and try to demand a peaceful transition to socialism. But it may be that through their organizing and such, we see, the imposition of some kind of fascist state to take away their democratic rights, and people may have to defend themselves in such a situation. But serious revolutionaries have always advocated a peaceful transition to socialism. And if you don't advocate a peaceful transition, if you advocate violence, if you advocate the violent overthrow of the government, people look at you like you're insane. The working class does not want violence. The working class are the ones that have to go out and fight the ugly wars that the capitalists wage around the world. The working class have violence in their communities, etc. They want an end to the violence. And we should be advocates of a peaceful transition, recognizing that if our democratic rights are taken away, we have the right to defend ourselves. Lincoln, was an advocate of a peaceful government. He just wanted to restrict slavery, but the slaveholders were violent in their attempt to break away from the United States. So Abraham Lincoln had the right to defend the Republic by engaging in the Civil War, which Marx called the Second American Revolution. So I believe in people's right to defend their democratic rights, to defend their country under such circumstances. Their rights are being taken away, but we advocate a peaceful transition.
Okay. So next question. Why is the word communist or socialist so widely vilified in the United States?
Well, because the USA was the center of global imperialism, is the center of global imperialism. And during the Cold War, it was the American government that was leading the fight against communism all over the world. And that, the United States was the center of, I guess, coming out of the Second World War, right? You had the rise of communism everywhere because the communists had been the heroic anti-fascists. In China, the communists had led the fight against Japan heroically. In the Eastern Europe, they had liberated a number of countries, and in so many countries. In Germany, the communists had led the underground resistance. You had the partisan brigades in Italy, and communists were the anti-fascists. And so after the Second World War, communists were very popular, and they were taking power in many different countries. But the United States which had a booming economy, right? Because the rest of the world had been destroyed in a war and American manufacturing got going. The United States was one place where the communists didn't come out of the war with a lot of strength, right? There was a Communist Party, but it was not as big. And so in the United States, there was a huge crackdown on the Communist Party and a huge effort to get Americans to understand that your identity as an American is tied up with capitalism. People compare it to the Spanish Inquisition. While the Protestant Reformation was happening all over Europe, Spain was a stronghold of feudalism in the Catholic Church. So they had a huge crackdown in the area where the Reformation hadn't taken hold. And that's what McCarthyism was. All over the world, communists were gaining ground. But the United States was one place where they didn't take hold. So they had a Spanish Inquisition of their own and just cracked down on communism in ways that were pretty horrifying. There was the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1951, which actually gave the government of the United States the ability to put communists in concentration camps. If there was a state of national emergency that was declared. And there was a huge effort to just kind of convince Americans that their whole identity is bound up with capitalism. I would argue, though, that the American spirit has a lot in it that is contrary to capitalism and is in line with socialism. For example, I will quote to you some very radical words that were written by a radical socialist in 1892. And they go like this. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Our Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist. People don't realize that Francis Bellamy, who was also a Baptist minister, was an advocate of socialism and an opponent of capitalism. And he was also an opponent of racial segregation. He was a Baptist minister who wouldn't preach to segregated congregations and was opposing segregation back in the 1890s and was an advocate of socialism. And that there are many examples. The word socialism itself was first used in the English language by Robert Owen. And Robert Owen was from Scotland, I believe, or Wales, but he came to the United States and set up a socialist commune called New Harmony in the U.S. state of Indiana. And that, Abraham Lincoln had a communist general in the Union Army named August Willich. August Willich was a communist who'd fought with Karl Marx in the 1848 German Revolution. And he came to the United States and he was a general in the Union Army, a brigadier general. Roosevelt, who's one of our most beloved presidents, he met with communist organizers at the White House. Gilbert Green, who was a leader of the Young Communist League, actually slept over at the White House, at the Roosevelt White House, when Congress was investigating Roosevelt for his ties to the Communist Party. And, I know for a fact that, when people talk about those good jobs that used to exist, the good jobs in the auto plants, the good jobs in the steel mills, you would never have had that if it wasn't for the Communist Party that built the industrial unions and organized the sit-down strikes. So communism is bound up with the American spirit. But since the 1950s, there's been a huge effort to try and erase that from our memory.
Same thing happened in the UK. Socialism gave us the National Health Service. I grew up in the UK. I'm an Australian citizen. Now I live in China. And, all of my life, I have had free healthcare until I came to China. So moving from the UK to Australia, I had free healthcare. These were brought about because of socialist movements at the time. You go back, my grandfather was a coal miner and in the north of England, and it was a pretty tough life, but he fought as a socialist. He fought for his rights, amongst other people. We have this very famous thing called the Jarrow March. Although my grandfather wasn't on that, he was around about that time, and he knew people who had been on that march. He was a little young for it at the time, but yeah, this is a very tough time for those people, and they fought very hard for standards that would help the working class, which are now, in the UK anyway, completely eroded and gone. Let's move on to one other thing that I wanted to ask you, because we talked about Donald Trump, and personally, I can't see Donald Trump being a socialist leader.
No.
What kind of person could lead MAGA or the socialist movement into the future? I don't see it being a Bernie Sanders type. What do you think?
I think it'd be somebody like Huey Long. We had a political leader in Louisiana in the 1930s. He was the governor of Louisiana. And his slogan was, "Every man a king, but none shall wear a crown." And he was a populist politician, and he started the Share Our Wealth movement.
Hmm.
I think of socialism in the United States kind of giving birth to populist figures who are fighting
Okay.
for working families, fighting for the working class. I look at old videos of Huey Long and his speeches about how we've got to share the wealth, we've got to make sure that American families have what they need and to
Right.
support economic growth. You
So
know,
he's
yeah.
either gone now or too old if he was a leader in the 1930s.
Yeah,
Uh,
sure, but his
so
share our wealth movement.
what
But
about
Roosevelt
in
had no
contemporary times?
problem.
Do we have a leader?
Well, Roosevelt had no problem aligning with communists, right? And that Roosevelt very much. I mean, if you listen to his Madison Square Garden speech that he gave during his 1936 campaign, he said, "Never before have Wall Street, been so united against a candidate, and I welcome their hatred." And Roosevelt said workers had the right to occupy their factories and sit down strikes. And
Right.
and I can see a figure emerging in the United States that would kind of give birth to that. But Donald Trump, he is a Bonapartist figure. He represents the lower levels of capital. And because he believes in economic growth and because he's not so enthusiastic about militarism and war, and because of these things, he's kind of giving birth to a section of the American working class and the lower levels of capital that are at odds with the prevailing, trend of imperialism, which is degrowth, which is regime change wars around the world. Donald Trump is the beginning of the kind of consciousness that could lead to a genuine socialist movement. That's my understanding of it. Donald Trump is not
Right.
a socialist, but his movement represents an awakening of the working class to some degree or other, and the lower levels of capital mobilizing the working class to resist the agenda of the ultra rich. And that's why MAGA communism is something I'm very interested in and have a positive perspective on.
I'm very interested in this term lower level of capitalism.
Sure.
Where does this lower level of capitalism stop and become a middle or higher level of capitalism? And I say this from a Chinese perspective because I actually have friends here who are multimillionaires, billionaires. I've got friends who have 40 cars, that kind of thing. These are very, very, very wealthy owners of large factories, employers of hundreds of people. But effectively, some of them are even Communist Party members. I've got a friend here who drives a Rolls Royce. He's a member of the National People's Congress, but he drives a Rolls Royce. It's kind of a dichotomy that I find a little bit, not disturbing, but confusing is probably the best word. Where does this low level capitalism turn into something different?
Well, I think that at this point, the ruling class in the United States is divided. And, Lenin wrote a very important book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, kind of
Mm-hmm.
talking about how in the 1890s, 1910 or so, capitalism was moving toward its monopolistic stage, and finance capital was becoming dominant over industrial capital. And there was a division in the ruling class around that. And that the dominant factor were the financiers, the bankers, right? And you have trusts, cartels, and syndicates, and major corporations that spread their tentacles all across the planet. And I think that in addition to that, you also just have a lot of millionaires and billionaires, and maybe they own a chain of hotels or a chain of restaurants, or I mean, many people look at Donald Trump, for example, and they see the fact that his name is on the side of buildings, right? Donald Trump is a guy who owns real estate and he owns a lot of buildings.
Mm.
He's actually tied to real buildings, something he's actually building something. Whereas, what does Goldman Sachs build? What do they create? They're just the middleman in
Right.
speculative transactions. And it's those kind of shady middlemen, financiers that kind of dominate, American capitalism to some degree. And, I think it was Stalin who coined the term captain of industry to refer to, certain capitalists that do actually build things, that do construct things, and how they have a different interest with finance capital to some degree.
Mm.
But I also want to make clear, we're not opposed to wealth, right? And this is a really important thing. The basis of the ultimate stage of communism, as Marx envisioned it, is a world with so much wealth and so much abundance that all inequality breaks down, the need for a state fades away. We're not against wealth. We're against those who make their wealth by impoverishing other people, right? We're against
Mm.
people getting rich by making other people poor. But the goal of socialism is to expand wealth for all of society. The rate of home ownership in China is higher than the rate of home ownership in America. Chinese people own their own homes far more than Americans do. I grew up, my parents, we owned our own home, but that's becoming a thing of the past. Americans are renting their homes from big banks or private corporations. And, in communist countries generally, go to Cuba, you go to Venezuela, people own their own homes. And the goal of socialism is to expand living standards, luxury for all, expand living standards with rational control of the means of production, have the state control the economy so that living standards and wealth can increase. And that's the idea. We're not opposed to wealth. We're opposed to exploitation. We're opposed to a group of billionaires and bankers dominating the economy and making themselves richer by making them the world poor. Right. And that's an important
providing
point to
no
make.
service for it other than the creation of wealth.
Yeah, and this is something we've been told in the United States. Communists want everyone to be poor. Communists want everyone to be equally poor. Deng Xiaoping said that poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious. And Margaret Thatcher in the UK, she has that quote about, I believe she said, what is it? Socialism doesn't work because you run out of other people's money. Right. I've heard that. Right. Well, if all Stalin had done was redistribute wealth that was already there, the Soviet Union would never have industrialized and defeated the Nazis and built the world's largest power plants and steel mills. If all Mao and Deng Xiaoping had done was redistribute wealth that was already there, China would still be the sick man of Asia. Socialism isn't about redistribution of income. It's about rational planning and control of the economy. It is about centralizing the means of production so that you can have a planned economy and wealth can expand for all. That is what socialism is. It's a change in property relations, and that the welfare state, having the government tax people in order to provide services. Every government in the world does that to some degree or other. That's not socialism. That's part of the management of capitalism. And we want a welfare state. I mean, I think people should have guaranteed jobs and income. I think that people should have a national health service, but that's still capitalism. That's part of managing capitalism. Socialism is a change in property relations. It's an economy organized to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
Okay, so that's a view on socialism. Let's go back to the MAGA thing. Do you think it's possible? Currently, you have Democrats and Republicans. It's a two-party system. Is it possible that the Communist Party of USA, your own organization, any organizations affiliated with MAGA, could they form up? Is it possible? Is it even legal to have a third option? Are they ever going to be that big?
I think that if you look at the history of this country, the Republican Party started out as a third party, right? Originally, we had the Whig Party and we had the Democratic Party. And then it became clear that the issue of slavery was such a pressing issue that we saw the rise of the Republican Party. And Karl Marx was a supporter of the Republican Party when it began. He was the correspondent for the New York Tribune. And that new political parties forming in the process of an awakening of the public and a political crisis in the United States, I think that's very, very possible. Now, my organization, the Center for Political Innovation, we are an education project. We educate people about socialism. We put on classes and seminars, and we publish books, and we are trying to lay the foundations of something by just educating people. But I think there will eventually, as the struggle moves forward, there will be new political parties that are formed. There'll be people running for office on a socialist platform. There'll be labor unions. There'll be community associations. Socialism requires an upsurge of democratic participation. The Chinese Communist Party has 90 million members, from what I understand. And if you go to Venezuela, they have those Bolivarian circles in every community. Cuba has the committees to defend the revolution. The word Soviet refers to council. It was these community councils, right? And that socialism requires an upsurge of democratic participation on the part of the population. Right now, we're in the early stages of this. The capitalist crisis is new. There's divisions in the ruling class. There's people asking what the future is for the country. And this is the beginning of the opening of a period where the working class could awaken, but we're only at the beginning.
Okay. I'm just going to respond to this one thing because someone's accusing me of not being an honest broker. If you take a look at my live streams coming up. You'll find next week is Haz al-Din, who is, I guess, the guy who coined the theory of MAGA communism, coming on the show next week. Caleb is the first of three. One of the people who's coming in is an ordinary, everyday grassroots member who calls himself a MAGA communist. And number three, which I think is probably the important one, without disrespecting Caleb at all, the guy who started it is coming on the show. So, please don't accuse me of taking one point against the other. Now, there was another comment that I saw come up here, and I wanted to address this. Now, the reason we started early, I'll just tell people here, because Caleb has to leave at the very latest in about 12 or 15 minutes. And there was one point I saw here, which I think this is the point. It seems to me this is a point that a lot of people believe. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. I'm going to put it to you and let you answer this question. As an outsider looking into America right now, I see a lot of division. I see that whenever there is one school of thought that wants to do something, there's another school of thought that doesn't want them to do it. You have it with gun laws, you have it with abortion, you have it with drugs, you have it with Medicare for all, you have it pretty much every single issue you can have. There seems to be a divisive opposite side to it. Is MAGA an artificial movement? And I'm not even sure what astroturfed means, but is it an artificial movement that's being pushed as a divisive method?
Well, astroturfed, that's generally a term used, when you talk about a grassroots movement, right? AstroTurf is fake grass, right? So astroturfed means it's the opposite of a grassroots movement. It's fake grass, right? That's a term that it's thrown around. It means you're manufactured by the establishment. You're not really a grassroots movement. And MAGA communism emerged, and again, that's not my brand. I've said I don't think it's strategic branding. I think it's designed to be kind of a very niche social media thing, but I like what it's pointing to. MAGA communism is a response to the fact that leftism in general, what calls itself socialism and communism in the United States, is at this point just working for the Ford Foundation and George Soros and some of the wealthiest capitalists. It's opposing all the countries around the world that have communist governments, and it's celebrating the CIA's regime change apparatus. Communists are the first people to. I mean, I point this out constantly, right? In America, communists hate Russia. They are the loudest enemies of Russia. They hate Russia. They hate Putin. But every communist government, every single one, supports Russia and Ukraine right now. China does, Vietnam does, Belarus does, Venezuela does, Cuba does, Nicaragua does. All the communists of the world support Russia and Ukraine right now. But Western communists who are obsessed with LGBT and that issue, who are constantly telling people to check their privilege and et cetera, that woke left that is funded by the Ford Foundation, that has roots in the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom program, that element is completely out of touch with the world communist movement. So my understanding is that what you might call MAGA communism is a response to that. It's a response to the fact that the left has lost its way and become enforcers of the Western regime change apparatus. It views the working class with contempt. And so because of that, we have people saying, well, actually, it's the working class folks who are opposed to the wars and opposed to the American establishment and opposed to the FBI. They are going to be the basis of a genuine communist movement. So I think there wouldn't be any talk of MAGA communism if most of the so-called left weren't already just kind of foot soldiers of the establishment. And it's a pushback against that.
So you're saying that the communist movement or the socialist movement in America has lost ground, and the MAGA is the response to it losing ground.
Yeah. MAGA communism is is an attempt on some people's part to say, look, the so-called left, have lost their way. And there are Americans that are rallying against the establishment, and they're doing it in the name of MAGA. And those are the people we should be talking to. We shouldn't be defending the establishment from them. We should be engaging with them. The Communist Manifesto, at the very end of it, it says communists everywhere support every movement against the existing order of things. But in all of them, they bring forward the property question, meaning whenever people are at odds with the establishment, communists engage with them. But while they engage with them, they put forward the property question, meaning, the problem with capitalist production. So if there's a group of people that are so angry with the government that they storm into the Capitol, that are rallying around a leader who's saying he wants to end wars and such, we should be engaging with them and supporting them while saying to them, the answer is not privatizations and cutbacks. The answer is not giving more weapons to Israel or other things that Trump advocates. The answer is socialism. So, I support the American people that are angry at the government, that are angry at the emerging low-wage police state. And I want to engage with them. I don't view them as the enemy, whereas a lot of the people who call themselves left, they just kind of hate average Americans who might turn to Trump because they're opposed to the American establishment.
I see. Right. So the next question is about democracy. And someone's put it, I was going to try and stay away from this, but because it leads to a good question. If America was born a genocidal colony, now, let's not get into the history of America, but what point do you reckon it grew up to be a democracy? Because you mentioned a little while ago, I live in China. Now, anyone sitting in America now will say, China's got no democracy. And I will say, you're wrong, but that's for another debate. We're not here to talk about China. We're here to talk about MAGA. So at what point do you have a democracy? And is it a real democracy? And at what point did it become one? If it ever did.
One of the most meaningful conversations I ever had on this topic was when I was in Iran. And the Iranians said, Caleb, we have a democracy here in Iran, but it's not a pure democracy, right? We have this thing called the Guardian Council. And if you want to run for office, the leaders of the Islamic Revolution, they have to approve you. And if they deem you to be in line with the Islamic Revolution of Iran, you're approved. Mm-hmm. And if you're not, you're not allowed to run. And they said to me, Caleb, in America, you have the exact same thing. It's called Wall Street. And they decide who the real candidates are, who, with the people with the money, they get together and they decide who's a real candidate, who's not, who gets media attention, who doesn't. Now, is it better to have your democracy be guided by a group of people that led the revolution, that overthrew the US-backed dictator, that have the ideology that lays the basis for the country, or whoever just happens to have the most money, right? And this is the point that Lenin makes in his book, The State and Revolution, and that he makes in the book, Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, is that pure democracy is only possible as we approach that ultimate goal of communism, a stateless, classless world. As long as there is inequality and some people own the banks, factories, and industries and others don't, as long as there is a society in which there is not vast abundance, there's going to be some level of guiding of democratic institutions. And the question is, do you want your democratic institutions guided by revolutionary forces that are striving toward that ultimate goal of communism, or do you want them guided by people who just happen to have a huge amount of wealth? Capitalism leads to a dictatorship, but it's a de facto dictatorship of whoever happens to have the most wealth. That's what we live under in the United States. This country isn't a democracy. It's a dictatorship by the ultra rich, the people who control the media, the people who, own the big tech monopolies, the people with the wealth who buy the politicians. They control the United States, and democracy is just kind of a sham because we're ruled by the rich. And we would like a society ruled by the working class and ruled by revolutionary forces who are organizing the economy to move us toward that ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world. And true democracy will emerge as we move toward a society without poverty and scarcity. And I think that that's an important point to understand.
Okay, one last question, because I know that you do need to go. Sure. Where you're going is more important than this. I understand that. One last question. How does it change? You're talking about I saw another debate that you were on where you talked about the oil producers and fracking and things like this. How does this change to the point where your country controls that without going through some massive upheaval where people who are extremely rich will employ people who are extremely poor to fight their battles for them? And you've got yourself another civil war, but it's not going to be a north-south. It's going to be a haves and have-nots civil war. And it's going to be poor people fighting poor people on behalf of one side, the government, and one side, the billionaires. That's how I see that going. Is there an alternative to that?
Well, part of the process of capitalism breaking down is what Marx referred to as Bonapartism, where sections of the ruling class begin fighting with each other in an attempt to stabilize the system. And it's through that process that working people are kind of awakened. But as far as the question of property, the US Constitution does lay out a procedure called eminent domain through which
Yeah.
private property can be nationalized or seized. And so there are procedures to allow it. And, we advocate, and I always make clear that genuine revolutionaries always advocate a peaceful transition through the democratic process. However, we do recognize that as the rich and powerful see the people rising up and demanding their rights and organizing democratically, they may begin to move towards some kind of authoritarian state to preserve their power. And under such circumstances, people would have the right to defend themselves. But we would prefer a peaceful transition. We don't want a civil war, right? We don't want chaos. We don't want instability. We are motivated by love of our country. And that's an important thing that separates us from so much of the woke left and all of that. We are motivated by a love of our country. We are socialists because we want to save America, not because we want to destroy America. We want a better life for working families. I want to address also, before I go, a point that you made earlier about the founding of the country and genocide and all of that. Sure. The United States was founded, with slavery. The United States was founded, with the slaughter of the indigenous people. And there is a deep spiritual curse that hangs over the United States. And there's no question about that. And I don't deny that. But I also want to point out that our country began with a revolution. And that was a revolution against the British Empire. And that was a revolution against the kind of global financial system the British were setting up that was trying to hold back economic development in the United States. And that, if you look at Abraham Lincoln and his struggle to defeat the slaveholders, if you look at the Great Awakening and great heroes like John Brown, the abolitionist who organized slave uprisings, there is a progressive side to the American people. A belief that we can, fight for freedom, a belief that we can oppose oppression of people, and that has to be what we appeal to. The idea that communism will come from without, right?
Mm-hmm.
That Americans are going to become Maoists, or Americans are going to become Kim Il-sungists, or or adopt Stalin or something like that. That's a delusion. Socialism, when it comes to the United States, will come from parts of the American spirit. And I would argue that in the abolitionists and in the suffragists who fought for women's rights, and in the labor movement, and in all the people in American history have stood against injustice, you will find a part of the American spirit that opposes racism, that opposes war, and could give birth to a genuine socialist movement. And that if we're serious about changing America, we have to find parts of the American spirit that can be used for good. We can't just stand on the outside of American society screaming in condemnation, which is what a lot of leftist forces do.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up, but one last point, because I think
Okay.
this one is important. We're not ready because we didn't connect with the people. I have a master's degree in cross-cultural change management. One of the things that I've focused on was Western business or Western management psychology and Chinese workplace philosophy. So these two things don't really go very well together. And in doing so, I've studied a lot about, particularly America, but about the Western cultural dimensions, the nature of the psychology of us. Americans are far more individualistic than Chinese, and that's a psychologically proven, academically proven fact. It's not an opinion. It's an academically proven fact. Chinese people will work better as a communally, communists. Individually, and it's not a bad thing, it's just a different thing. Americans work individually. So how do you connect with the people when you are a nation of 330 million individuals, when China is a nation of 1.4 billion Chinese people? Not so individual. Of course, there's individuals in here in the country, but they are much more collective in nature. How does it work?
I would argue that the alienation that Americans are experiencing right now, the individualism, and the economic problems that people are facing are going to necessitate people coming together. If you read the Communist Manifesto, once again, he talks about how as the working class, as their life becomes more and more unstable, they form combinations and come together to advocate for their rights. And that during the Great Depression, we saw this. People were hungry. people were starving, so they formed unemployment councils to go and demand the government, do something about it. They formed labor unions, and that working people, as they suffer economically, are going to have to come together. They're going to have to learn to rely on each other as they fight for their rights against the rich and powerful, and that this is kind of the natural process. And that while we have a very individualistic culture, I think people are going to realize that, again, at the end of the day, we're all in this together. I mean, it's our country, it's our world. And that, that they're going to have to overcome the kind of radical individualism that our culture pushes. I think that is going to be the result of this. But social media is very, very good at atomizing people. And I think, you commented on it, the fact that everyone's accusing everyone of everything else. Social media very much is about atomizing people. And part of that is making everyone suspicious of everyone else, highlighting the differences. And I also want to add that part of the reason that people in the United States that are interested in communism or MAGA communism or whatever are so alienated from each other, this is because it's just intellectual talking on the internet. But a real movement, and if you're building actual activity in real organizations, you want to make alliances. You want to actually get things done. You want to find out how you can work with other people and get real things done in the real world. But if it's just an intellectual exercise, you can sit there and say, I have the most pure idea, etc. And that a lot of internet communism is just what my friend Peter Coffin calls commodified identity. People just kind of want, to be able to put a label on themselves. I'm a communist. I look at my communist shoes, look at my communist hat I just bought. This is this identity I try on. But the process of actually building organizations that struggle against imperialism, building real communities of solidarity is a very, very different thing. So, I've been saying to people that, getting things done in real life. I know there's protests coming up against the NATO summit, that's happening. The NATO summit is coming up, and there's people that really, want to have real protests and opposition to it. And in order to do that, they're going to have to find people with whom they might not disagree, with whom they have differences, and come together and have these events. And so I would urge people that want to do things in real life to realize that that in the real world, you need friends and allies. You don't just want to prove that you're the most pure and that you're the best.
All right. Thank you. We have reached 10 past 10 on my time, and I promised you we would finish by now. So let's call it a day. But will you come back in about 4 weeks and have a discussion about communism in America with me here in China?
Yes, and let's do it on a day when I have much more time. I'm looking forward to it. This has been a great chat.
I think we can talk a lot longer. Thank you, everybody who came in. We went up to nearly 300, which is very good for me, especially this time of night. But thank you, everybody, and thank you, Caleb. I will see you in about 4 weeks' time.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Everyone.
Yep. Bye-bye.
So thank you, everyone, for